It is my profound pleasure to welcome you to the 4th International Conference on the Safe Schools Declaration.
We are pleased that this conference, for the first time, takes place in an African country. We believe this can bolster the efforts to improve the conditions of children in this continent.
For us in the African Union, we are in partnership with the United Nations and all leading intergovernmental bodies to make this change happen, centered on peace education and making sure that our own policies in-house will also be upgraded and reviewed regularly through the PCRD, what is called the Post-Conflict Reconstruction and Development Framework.
Garantizar el derecho a la educación es una parte fundamental de la respuesta humanitaria a las situaciones de emergencia, ya que la educación tiene un rol clave en la construcción de un diálogo que lleva a la cooperación, a la reconstrucción de la paz y a la protección de los derechos humanos.
Stop the war on children. Let decisions be made with children so that their voices can be heard loudly in the nation. If you serve a child today, you have reserved a better tomorrow for the nation.
The children describe how they live in fear. They call on us to protect their right to education. They call on us to prevent attacks and military use of schools and universities. It is our duty to listen. So let's take action now and put the declaration into practice.
There can be no stability and no prosperity without education. That is why there is no excuse to justify harm inflicted to schools.
You have suffered too much from the interruption of schooling because of terrorism and threats. It is now for us, the whole international community, to show our solidarity and to support your efforts to build back better, to make schools safe and secure, to make a reality of the promise of high-quality education for every boy and in particular every girl. And I pledge to work with you to achieve this.
UNICEF and our partners are working tirelessly so that all children can realize their right to learn.
Education is not only a right for every child, it's also a pathway to a better, brighter and more peaceful future.
Imagine the thousands of children and young people who are forced to share their classrooms with soldiers occupying the building. Those kids face daily risks of crossfire, sexual violence, or even child recruitment.
We've assisted in having to rebuild some of the schools. We have equally provided security to enable our teachers and other caregivers in our various training institutions, that is school establishments, for them to be able to undertake their responsibilities.
The long-term repercussions of attacks against education must be put at the center of international decision-making.
We've also created the ability for young people, the children parliament, some of whom you saw yesterday. All of that advocacy modules have already been energized.
We urge other states to make concrete commitments themselves to bring the lessons learned at this conference back home and to work towards building a society in which all children and young people can study and learn in safety, and educators and academics can teach and conduct research without the threat of violence.
Domestic judicial systems is actually fundamentally important to ensure that we achieve accountability for education, attacks on education. But also critical is that governments assist victims, and this is obviously a commitment under the Safe Schools Declaration. The survivors often tell Human Rights Watch investigators that they desperately need psychosocial support and compensation for losses.
When schools are occupied or even destroyed, students lose out on their access to education. And when children get abducted and are forced to become soldiers, most will later struggle to recover the gift of education that was stolen from them.
For we must be tireless in our efforts to safeguard this fundamental right, the right on which all other rights are built.
Et nous renforçons les capacités des enseignants et particulièrement des enseignantes pour la prise en charge des filles. Nous recrutons également au sein des communautés affectées des femmes modèles, des mentors qui servent comme guides et comme conseillères pour les filles gravement atteintes et qui ont besoin de suivi psychosocial.
On behalf of children across the world, I call on world leaders to endorse and implement the SSD for the safety and well-being of children and schools. Thank you very much.
Good morning. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the virtual launch of Education Under Attack 2022. My name is Zayma Neff, and I'm the Child Rights Director at Human Rights Watch and a member of the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack. This event is organized by the coalition, GCPIA, and co-sponsored by the permanent missions to the United Nations in New York of Argentina, Norway, Nigeria, and Spain. Before we get started, I'll mention a few general features of this virtual event. First, the session is being recorded and streamed live on Vimeo. The chat function will be open, and please use this to signal that you would like to take the floor, either to give a statement or to ask a question, and then we'll include you on the speakers list. The release of Education Under Attack 2022 marks the 7th anniversary of the Safe Schools Declaration, launched in Oslo on May 28, 2015. The Safe Schools Declaration is an intergovernmental political commitment to protect education during armed conflict. The commitments in the declaration, when they're carried out, can save the lives of civilians. They can preserve the civilian character of educational facilities, and they can protect education from attack more generally. To date, 114 states have joined the Safe Schools Declaration, 114 and counting. Now, the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack is a unique coalition of UN agencies and non-governmental organizations that has been working for more than 10 years to protect education from both targeted and indiscriminate attacks by armed forces and armed groups. Education Under Attack is the flagship publication of GCPIA. The report documents attacks on schools, universities, their students and staff, and military use of schools and universities between the period of January 1st, 2020 to December 31st, 2021, so a 2-year period. The report documents both the impacts of attacks as well as positive developments in protecting education during war. The Global Coalition thanks our donors for their generous support for Education Under Attack 2022. These include the Education Above All Foundation, Education Cannot Wait, the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and an anonymous donor foundation. Now I would like to introduce you to our opening remarks that come to us by video message from Ms. Anniken Huitfeldt, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Norway. Together with Argentina, Norway has spearheaded the development of the Safe Schools Declaration. And equally important, it is working to put the declaration's commitments into practice through a global implementation network for endorsing states, and also through its role in the UN Security Council, where together with Niger, it led on UN Security Council Resolution 2601. Now for the opening remarks of Ms. Anniken Huitfeldt.
Thank you for inviting Norway to co-organize this global launch of the Education Under Attack 2022 report, together with the Global Coalition. The report documents a global increase in attacks on education and an increase in military use of schools and universities. This happened even when schools and universities were closed due to COVID-19. The Education Under Attack report is a brutal reminder of how important it is to protect education. Security Council Resolution 2601 was initiated by Niger and Norway. It calls on member states to ensure the protection of schools and safeguard education. The resolution was unanimously adopted by the Council. The resolution is in line with the Safe School Declaration presented in Oslo in 2015. Together, we mark the 7th anniversary of the Declaration. It is now endorsed by 114 states. I want to stress what it means to endorse the Safe School Declaration. It is a commitment to protect education from attack and military use. It is a commitment to safeguard the right to education during armed conflict. And it is a commitment to protect children and young people from violence and abuse. Political commitment must be followed up by implementation. Last year, we initiated the Implementation Network. It provides a key platform to share best practices and propose solutions to protect education. I urge all to work hard to make the Declaration universal. Endorsing and implementing the Safe School Declaration is a concrete way to fulfill Security Council Resolution 2601. Thank you.
I thank the Minister for her remarks and especially appreciate the emphasis on putting into practice strong protections for education in armed conflict. I would now like to introduce you to Ms. Pilar Cancela Rodriguez, the Secretary of State for International Cooperation of Spain, who will also deliver opening remarks. Spain is making important contributions to the implementation of the Safe Schools Declaration at the global level, not the least through its training initiatives on the Declaration for endorsing states. Over to Ms. Pilar Cancela Rodriguez.
Buenos días a todos y a todas en Nueva York, buenas tardes en Europa. Como ha dicho mi colega noruego, estamos reunidos hoy aquí para dar la bienvenida al informe sobre ataques a la educación y sus instalaciones correspondiente al año 2021. La recolección de datos es una prioridad para España porque contando con datos imparciales, fiables, en tiempo y forma, se podrán adaptar medidas de prevención, protección, reclamación y de condena de esos ataques. Por tanto, permitidme que utilice esta plataforma para felicitar a la Coalición Global para la Protección de la Educación frente a ataques. En 2021, según datos de la propia coalición, continuaron los ataques contra la educación, así como el uso militar de escuelas y universidades en los más variados contextos: Tigray, Myanmar, Palestina o Afganistán. Lamentablemente, la guerra en Ucrania no está siendo una excepción a los ataques contra las escuelas y las instalaciones educativas en general. Al igual que Naciones Unidas, no podemos más que condenar desde el primero hasta el último de los ataques contra instalaciones civiles, especialmente cuando estas son escuelas. No hay que olvidar que constituyen una evidente violación del derecho internacional humanitario y que impactan directamente sobre la población civil que nunca debería verse afectada por ello. Las escuelas deben ser espacios seguros e inviolables para la infancia, y el profesorado también, y los ataques contra ellas están clasificadas por las Naciones Unidas como una de las 6 violaciones graves cometidas contra la infancia. Las escuelas del este de Ucrania cerraron el pasado 21 de febrero al intensificarse las hostilidades, dejando a unos 350.000 niños y niñas sin acceso a la educación. Desde entonces, los ataques no han cesado, cuando se han cumplido más de 3 meses desde el inicio de la guerra. A pesar de la violencia extrema y el impacto devastador en el alumnado, profesorado y en la comunidad educativa en general, lo cierto es que cada vez el consenso en torno a la protección de la educación se ve más fortalecido. Los Estados, incluidas las Fuerzas Armadas, las organizaciones regionales y de Naciones Unidas y la sociedad civil, adoptaron nuevas leyes, políticas y prácticas para promover el aprendizaje seguro y proteger vidas, y reforzaron sus esfuerzos para transformar los compromisos de la Declaración de Escuelas Seguras. La Declaración sobre Escuelas Seguras constituye un compromiso político insoslayable para garantizar el derecho a la educación durante los conflictos armados. Desde su aprobación en 2015, somos ya 114 Estados los que nos hemos comprometido a proteger a estudiantes y docentes y a evitar que las escuelas y universidades se conviertan en recursos u objetivos militares, contribuyendo así a preservar el carácter civil de estas instalaciones. España mantiene su firme compromiso con esta agenda. La Conferencia de Palma supuso un paso decisivo para proteger la educación frente a los ataques en las situaciones de conflicto y puso de relieve los significativos avances que las administraciones públicas y la sociedad civil hemos logrado para garantizar que las escuelas sean un lugar seguro y ofrezcan protección al conjunto de la comunidad educativa. En cumplimiento del compromiso adquirido entonces por el Gobierno de España, de la mano de la que es aliada imprescindible la Global Coalition, la Agencia Española de Cooperación Internacional para el Desarrollo, que tengo el honor de presidir, organizó en 2021 el primer programa internacional de formación técnica en la materia. Durante 4 semanas, más de 90 representantes de los Ministerios de Educación, Defensa y Exteriores de los 20 estados invitados, Argentina y Noruega, y una apreciada representación de la sociedad civil e instituciones académicas, compartimos un espacio de trabajo virtual orientado al análisis conjunto y a la identificación de buenas prácticas y experiencias. Urge consolidar avances, incrementar compromisos y afianzar alianzas. Los países en conflicto deben saber que cuentan con aliados en este camino, entre los que indudablemente se encuentra España. Los compromisos que todos nuestros estados han asumido al adherirse a la declaración deben traducirse en medidas concretas. Y en este trabajo de la comunidad internacional en su conjunto, la labor de investigación y análisis de la Coalición Global para proteger la educación frente a los ataques es sencillamente esencial. Frente a este grave problema, un grupo de organizaciones activas en áreas relacionadas con la agenda de protección humanitaria creó junto al TAI Center la Coalición Global. Sin duda alguna, no cabe más que felicitar a todo el equipo de la coalición por el trabajo y, en el caso de España, agradecer especialmente la estrecha colaboración en todas las iniciativas llevadas a cabo en este ámbito. En esta labor de la coalición cabe agradecer también el compromiso de Noruega y Argentina, países impulsores de la declaración, con cuyas iniciativas nos alineamos y con quienes hemos contado y contaremos para las iniciativas futuras en esta agenda. Y agradecer también el trabajo de las ONGs internacionales y locales y de la sociedad civil en su conjunto, que junto a los Estados están jugando un papel fundamental. Su apoyo y confianza son la clave para tener éxito y proteger la educación.
Thank you very much to the Secretary for those excellent remarks and for the leadership of Spain in the implementation of the Safe Schools Declaration. I'd now like to turn to UNICEF, a member of the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack, for remarks from Ms. Catherine Russell, the Executive Director of UNICEF. Thank you.
I'm very glad to join in this virtual launch of the 2021 Education Under Attack report. I want to thank the governments of Norway, Spain, and Argentina, and the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack for co-organizing this important event. 7 years ago, the world came together to declare that schools must always be safe places for children to learn and develop, even in times of armed conflict. While we have made progress in mobilizing awareness and support to deliver on the Safe Schools Declaration, education continues to be under attack in far too many countries and communities all over the world. In 2021, reports of attacks on education and military use of schools continued, with Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Palestine, and Myanmar experiencing notable spikes. Military use of schools and universities more than doubled in 2020 and 2021 compared to reports in 2018 and 2019. Targeted attacks against girls and women and violent repression of education for girls and women increased in at least 11 countries. Around 1/5 of all reported attacks on education and schools involve the use of explosive weapons, which kill and maim thousands of children every year. Unfortunately, these trends may only increase in 2022, as we are seeing so tragically in Ukraine. Attacks on education and schools do more than threaten children's lives and future livelihoods. They threaten societies, increasing inequality and undermining sustainable growth. They are attacks on our shared future. Ultimately, those who are waging war have the legal and moral obligation to end attacks on education, but we must resolve to hold them accountable. the UN Security Council's recent adoption of Resolution 2601, condemning attacks against schools and calling for children's rights to be safeguarded, is a step in the right direction. But we need to translate this into concrete action, turning resolutions and hard-won policy change into concrete action on the ground. I look forward to working together to reignite the global effort to end attacks on education and to protect the right of every child to an education.
I'd like to thank Ms. Russell for those remarks, and I especially appreciate the call for accountability for attacks on schools, teachers, and students, and also military use of schools. Now, we would like to turn to the research itself. And I'd like to introduce Dr. Marika Tsolakis and Dr. Jerome Marston, who are senior researchers at the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack. Marika and Jerome, since the last edition of Education Under Attack was released in 2020, so much has happened globally, not the least of which the COVID-19 pandemic. In your view, and from your research, what are the major trends that have emerged in the last 2 years related to attacks on education and military use of schools and universities? And if I can add, in your research, where have you observed increases or decreases in attacks around the world? And I'll remind you to unmute yourself, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Seema. Before we begin to answer your question, we first want to thank the Norwegian, Spanish, Argentine, and Nigerian missions for co-hosting this launch event. And a huge thank you to everyone who is joining us virtually today. We're honored to be here to present the findings of the Education Under Attack 2022 report, which examines attacks on education in 2020 and 2021. As you said, when the last edition of the report was published 2 years ago, we were just beginning to understand and to measure the different ways in which COVID-19 would impact our coalition's work. Unfortunately, we now know that attacks on education and military use increased during the pandemic. On average, 6 attacks on education or cases of military use occurred per day in the last 2 years. More difficult to quantify, however, is the daily suffering of students and educators around the world resulting from these attacks. Beyond the immediate injury and loss of life, attacks on education upend learning. They destroy schools and they inflict lasting stress and trauma. These findings are alarming, but our report also gives reason for hope by shedding light on the tremendous progress in protecting education in recent years. Since the last report was launched in 2020, 10 countries have endorsed the Safe Schools Declaration. I think this is something we can celebrate today. Our hope is that this research impels further endorsements and actions to protect education during conflict. The Education Under Attack 2022 report profiles 28 conflict-affected countries with a systematic pattern of attacks on education, which are defined as the actual or threatened use of force against schools and universities or their teachers and students by military, other state security forces, and non-state armed groups. We compile data from the UN, NGOs, media, and partners in the field. The key message that we want you to take home today is that attacks on education rose in 2020 and 2021, even as the COVID-19 pandemic forced schools to close for extended periods. We identified over 5,000 reports of attacks on education and incidents of military use of schools and universities over the last 2 years. These attacks harmed at least 9,000 students and educators. Of great concern, we saw military use doubling during this period as compared to earlier 2 years. In some countries, armed forces and non-state armed groups took advantage of vacant schools during the COVID-19 pandemic to use them for military purposes. Attacks and military use increased in several countries, including Burkina Faso, Colombia, Ethiopia, Mali, Myanmar, and Nigeria. However, we also did observe decreases in a few places, such as South Sudan, Syria, and Yemen, and these were largely related to conflict de-escalation. We'd now like to dive a little bit deeper into the report's findings. First, attacks on schools made up around 2/3 of all reported attacks on education, or approximately 3,000 incidents over the past 2 years. The DRC, Mali, and Palestine were the countries that were most affected by attacks on schools. And more shockingly, they had very significant impacts. In Mali, over 1,000 schools closed due to threats of violence. In DRC and Palestine, hundreds of schools were damaged or destroyed by bombings, arson, looting, or crossfire. School students and teachers were also directly targeted or specifically impacted in 2020 and 2021. Nearly 5,000 students and educators were harmed, around half of whom were reportedly injured, killed, abducted, or threatened, and the other half of whom were arrested or convicted. In countries where students and teachers were often targeted, such as Palestine, Cameroon, and the Sahel, attacks came to a near halt during periods of lockdown in the first half of 2020, before skyrocketing again when schools reopened later that year. We really observed this in Nigeria, where abductions of school students dramatically escalated in late 2020 and continued throughout 2021. For instance, armed assailants reportedly stormed a girls' secondary school in Zamfara State in February 2021, abducting at least 279 schoolgirls.
As mentioned earlier, incidents of military use of education facilities doubled in the past 2 years. Nearly 40%, or over 220 reported cases of military use occurred in Myanmar alone. We also observed increases in Central African Republic, Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, and Iraq. Military use often precipitated other attacks, including child recruitment. In 2020 and 2021, JCPOA identified reports of child recruitment at or on the way to or from school in 4 countries: Colombia, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Mali, and Yemen. And we believe that the magnitude of this violation is actually greater, since this type of attack is often underreported. Also underreported is sexual violence, perpetrated by parties to conflict at or on the way to or from school or university. We identified reports of this type of attack in 7 countries over the last 2 years, and this violation affected both boys and girls, teachers, and students. Universities were also caught in the crossfire. We identified at least 320 reports of attacks on higher education. 3/4 of these were attacks on students and staff, and the remainder impacted tertiary education facilities. For example, in Yemen, the Hudaydah University Faculty of Engineering, which was located on a front line, was shelled around a dozen times in the past 2 years. We also want to highlight a new area of analysis in the report. We found that approximately 1/5 of all attacks on education in the last 2 years involved explosive weapons. These attacks occurred in at least 25 countries and caused tremendous loss of life, damage, and destruction. Data from Syria illustrates this. GCPOA identified 85 attacks on schools and universities involving air and ground-launched explosive weapons in 2020 and 2021. These attacks injured or killed at least 32 students and educators and damaged or destroyed at least 80 education facilities. One aim of the report is to raise awareness about the scope and impact of attacks on education. But as an international community, we must harness this awareness to truly protect education. Armed parties should cease attacks and avoid using schools and universities for military purposes. To that end, we urge states to endorse and implement the Safe Schools Declaration, and all parties to conflict to implement the guidelines for protecting schools and universities from military use during armed conflict. In addition, we recommend 4 actions. First, national and international justice institutions should investigate attacks on education and hold perpetrators to account. Second, states and relevant organizations should strengthen the monitoring and reporting of attacks on education. Third, armed parties should avoid the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas, including near schools or universities or along routes to or from them. Fourth, and finally, education providers should continue to expand distance learning and other alternative programs established in response to COVID-19 to benefit learners out of school due to attacks. Despite the startling findings presented today, positive steps can be taken to protect education, including through the declaration and the core recommendations of the report. The events currently unfolding in Ukraine are a reminder of the urgent action that is needed. Before finishing, we would like to acknowledge the Education Above All Foundation, Education Cannot Wait, the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and an anonymous donor for their generous support. Thank you all. Zema, we turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, Jerome and Marika. I think this is such compelling presentations of the findings of your research. And we'll put the link up at the end of the presentation, but I want to let everyone know that you can find the full report on the Coalition's website, protectingeducation.org. I also really appreciated the clear set of recommendations that you were presenting. And I know in many of us, that's going to spark some good questions for the question and answer portion of this event. But now I would like to turn to Mr. Mahir Hazim, who is visiting associate research professor at Arizona State University at Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law. Professor Hazim, you were teaching at the Al-Biruni University in Afghanistan when a deadly attack took place. Could you please tell us more about the dangers that you have faced as an educator in Afghanistan and the impact that those dangers have had on you? The floor is yours, and I'll just remind you to unmute your microphone.
Thank you very much for the question, Zema. Hello, everyone. It's a great honor to be here and share my experiences with you today. I started my work as a lecturer at Al-Biruni University Faculty of Law and Political Science in 2013. Al-Biruni University is located in Kapisa province, approximately 60 miles north of Kabul. I taught many courses, including constitutional law, family law, criminal and civil procedure, and public administration. I was passionate about my work and enjoyed teaching and engaging with the students. I would commute with colleagues from Kabul to Al-Biruni University by university bus or by car. It was a 2-hour drive that crossed several districts before reaching campus. Although the route was not very secure and safe early on, the security situation along the highway got worse day by day over the last decade due to the volatile and deteriorating security situation across Afghanistan. I can remember at least 4 attacks had been attempted on the vehicles of Al-Biruni University and prior to 2021, which included shooting at or placing bombs in professors' vehicles. Amidst the increasing insecurity in 2015, I was able to obtain a scholarship and came to the United States to complete my LLM and PhD degrees. In August 2020, I returned to Afghanistan. I resumed my teaching at Al-Biruni University. Unfortunately, upon my return, I realized that the security situation had deteriorated dramatically. Threats were growing, violence was intensifying, and the Taliban was advancing very quickly after the total withdrawal of US and NATO forces from Afghanistan. In particular, the Taliban were gaining control of territories in Kapisa province as well as Parwan province, which was very close to Al-Biruni University. During this time, insecurity and targeted killings sharply increased along the highway, which I took to commute to campus. In fact, on Afghan social media, the route was called the Death Highway due to the high number of targeted killings occurring daily. The university itself was not much safer. Taliban and unknown terrorist groups threatened the campus security guards almost every week, saying that they would attack the university and its professors. Regrettably, they finally did attack our university when they bombed a minibus carrying professor from Al-Bair University to Kabul on May 29, 2021. Tragically, at least 3 of my colleagues were killed and many others were severely injured. I was quite fortunate that I did not go to the university the day that bombing occurred. After the attack, I had to quit the university. As the situation was getting much more dire and unbearable, I started looking for a way out of Afghanistan. I applied for different fellowships, including the Institute of International Education's Scholar Rescue Fund, IIESRF, which granted me a fellowship right after the Taliban takeover. Amidst the chaotic evacuation, with the help of the Max Planck Foundation, the German military evacuated me to Germany. From there, I finalized my fellowship with IIESRF and came to Arizona State University College of Law. I currently conduct academic research, publish in journals, and present my research papers in conferences and workshops. I will also teach and offer a course next semester. While I feel very lucky that I am safe and able to continue my academic work at ASU, I want to remember many of my colleagues and Afghan scholars and students who have been trapped in an extremely difficult situation in Afghanistan. It's also painful and heart-wrenching to see the continued ban on girls' education, the continued deadly attacks on high schools and educational centers, and unbearable restriction on Afghan educators and students, particularly women, and the remaking and radicalization of schools and universities curricula by the de facto authorities. To conclude, I would like to express my gratitude to the IIESRF team for their continued support and wholeheartedly appreciate the vital work of GCPA for protecting and promoting education in war-torn areas. I truly believe in the power of education and knowledge. And as I always say this to my friends and colleagues, if only one thing could rescue Afghanistan from its misery, it would be education. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Hazim, and for bringing us that very personal and immediate account that really brings home what it is that this endeavor is trying to achieve. I mean, unfortunately, attacks on education are nothing new in Afghanistan, and it's especially devastating to hear your account, but also to understand so deeply how many children, especially girls, are being completely denied education in Afghanistan. So thank you for those remarks. Let me now turn to Amnesty International, the newest member of the Global Coalition, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Agnes Callamard, who is the Secretary General of Amnesty International. Dr. Callamard, Amnesty International plays a critical role in investigating violations of international law, including attacks on education in conflict settings, and also in advocating for accountability. How is Amnesty documenting attacks on education, and how can we all strengthen accountability for attacks?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to join you this afternoon for me. It's a great honor for Amnesty International to be part of the steering committee for the Global Coalition to protect education from attack. It is, as you mentioned, we are one of the newcomers, but a very committed newcomer and absolutely keen to do everything we can to ensure that that the work of the coalition and the demands to stop attacks on education be fully implemented. So Amnesty International is a human rights organization which follows a very rigorous methodology for all of its investigation. And we are pursuing the same rigor and the same meticulous methodology for our research on attacks on education. We use a range of methods, including testimonies from witnesses, from students, from teachers, We are using verification, scientific verification of videos and video materials and photos. We're using satellite imagery. So all the tools at our disposal, we put that to good effect for the investigation of attacks on education. For instance, within 36 hours of a strike on 25th of February on a nursery and kindergarten in Ukraine, we had confirmed the use of a 220 millimeters Uragan rocket that dropped cluster munition, killing 3 people, including a child in Ukraine. We interviewed witnesses, verified photograph, identified the weapon system used. It was a sign in those first week, in fact, of the first days of the Russian invasion, of the devastation being brought on the people of Ukraine, but particularly on the children. Indeed, schools from the primary to the universities have been hit in many areas of Ukraine. And we've seen frequent use of school as military bases, which puts education and schools at risk. UNICEF recently reported that 1 in 6 UNICEF-supported safe schools in eastern Ukraine had been destroyed or damaged since the start of the war. This destruction will have profound effect on children's rights, is having profound effect on children's rights, including educations, but their personal growth more generally, their ability to become who they want to be. What we see in Ukraine today really highlight the importance of the Safe School Declaration, but also its limitation, and therefore the need to do far more to strengthen norms around the prevention of attacks and ending the use of school by militaries. What's happening in Ukraine and in many other parts of the world is really highlighting the need for greater accountability. Because Ukraine, of course, is not the only place where education and schools are being targeted. We at Amnesty International have documented attacks on schools in conflict around the world, and the presentation done by the 2 researchers, Marika and Jerome, does highlight the breadth and the scale and the seriousness of the phenomenon we are seeking to address today. In a report we are releasing today, as a matter of fact, on war crimes and possibly crimes against humanity by the military in eastern Myanmar, we have documented airstrikes and shelling that have destroyed many schools. We have also documented the military's use of school as bases and even as detention facilities, where they have subjected civilians to torture and other ill treatment. The place that should be a place of protection is now becoming, in many places around the world, a place of death and a place of killings and torture. In other conflicts, such as across the Sahel, armed actors make schools a deliberate target, killing, abducting, threatening students and teachers, destroying school buildings. In a September 2021 report, Amnesty highlighted what's happening in Niger's tri-border region. We documented how harm group, including the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara and the Al-Qaeda affiliated, have burned schools and threatened teachers. Their attacks have caused the closure of hundreds of schools in the region alone, forcing, as of the time of our report's publication, more than 31,000 children, including 15,000 girls, out of school. A 14-year-old boy who had not been to school for several years told us, "We really don't like that the school closed. After our school closed, we stayed at home. There was anything left for us." Attacks on education, violations against the right of children to education, the right of children to be with their peers, to grow, to develop. All of those things have been largely absent from domestic and international criminal investigation and prosecutions. Yes, we have seen a number of cases, and there is awareness around child soldiers. But the attacks and the targeting of education has been neglected. Granted, there are a lot of things that a judge could focus on, but it will be really important for court around the world, for international court, the International Criminal Court, for courts maybe using universal jurisdiction, for national courts such as in Ukraine. It will be really important to start building the jurisprudence on international crimes committed against education. We need to see a marked shift as well to center the voice and experience of children in those processes, because they are also largely absent from the process. And to be effective, a child-centered approach must really be intersectional, must include the focus on girl and boy children, children with disability, children of different ages. We need to insist that children have the same right to justice and reparation as any other groups. We need to elaborate, to think through, to explore what reparation means for a child. It may not mean the same as for an adult, but we absolutely have to engage much more forcefully in those topics. It's matters, of course, to the children that are at heart, the heart of those inquiries and investigation. But I will say it matters to us all. It matters to the world we want to build. Thank you very much.
Thank you for those excellent and meaningful remarks. And I think the research of Amnesty International and others really demonstrates what comes forth in Education Under Attack, which is that this is a widespread problem in war, as demonstrated by the 28 detailed country profiles in Education Under Attack. But because the problem is so widespread, it demands a global solution. And I'll also just mention the appreciation for your points about accountability and how important it is, especially now that accountability mechanisms have from the very outset a mandate to look at abuses and crimes like attacks on schools, and that the expertise to do those kinds of investigations be built in from the very beginning so that there are hard consequences for attacks on schools, teachers, and students. So thank you. Now I would like to turn to Ms. Yasmin Sharif, the Director of Education Cannot Wait, who has been a tireless advocate for safe schools. Ms. Sharif, Education Cannot Wait delivers education to children in conflict zones around the world. And this offers these children vital stability and hope for the future. How do you ensure that children and youth can access safe and protective learning opportunities?
Thank you very much, Sama. And thank you very much to GCPA, a close partner of Education Cannot Wait, to Norway, Germany, Argentina, and Niger for organizing this launch of GCPA's report. Let me say like this, we have heard many countries mentioned, and I'm glad that the focus is not exclusively on Ukraine, though my talking points will use Ukraine as an example. But I really want to stress the ongoing attacks on schools, teachers, and students in Palestine, in Mali, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Cameroon, and so many other places on earth that has been going on for decades with impunity. and no accountability. And here I speak as a human rights lawyer. Accountability, and I keep hearing it, is so very, very important. Otherwise, we are creating an absolutely lawless world. Now, we all know that from the perspective of Education Cannot Wait, we are a rights-based global fund for education in emergencies and protracted crisis. We all know that no child can learn in safety, or no teacher can teach if their schools are being attacked, if they're being abducted, if they are trafficked, or boys are abducted as child soldiers. So it's a very fundamental condition for any kind of education. And this takes us to the Safe School Declaration, which is a merger and a reminder of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. And that's where the accountability comes in. We at Education Cannot Wait, we invest funding in 42 countries. And I will use Ukraine as an example because it's the latest one, but again, I want to stress it's not the only one. So according to the education cluster in Ukraine, over 1,800 educational institutions have been damaged. And just over 170 of them have been completely destroyed. This represents 20% of Ukraine's education infrastructure. Now, Ukraine was a signatory, was the 100th signatory of the Safe Schools Declaration. And we, of course, are a strong advocate for the Safe School Declaration, knowing how it is based on international law. So from our perspective, since we don't deal with accountability per se, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International and others, together with GCPA, do a great job on that. And I really admire your legal work on that. But what we do is that we mobilize financial resources so that host governments can take action to fulfill the obligations under the Safe Schools Declaration and thereby international law to ensure that schools are safely protected. But there is a limitation to what they can do, of course. When you have aerial bombing of schools, there's very little that the government under attack can do, or even a non-governmental partner like in Gaza, for instance. It's very little you can do, even with funding, to protect yourself. But that's what we do. We invest in funding, and through our emergency responses, we provide grants so that you at least can try to mitigate the impact and provide safe and protective learning spaces. Because we work in most conflict-affected countries, most of the countries where we invest receives that kind of funding as part of the broader funding envelope to ensure that there's both physical protection, if not the legal, because so many others do that, and we're happy to cooperate with you, but at least the physical protection, and that the school educational environment has some resemblance of protection. Now, so what we would recommend, and to all our strategic donor partners, whether it's ODA donors or private sector attending this call, please provide funding so that we can at least bring some physical protection on the ground and secure educational facilities and learning on the ground. We have a very strong protection dimension in all our investments. And I also want to remind all of those who have the funding and can do it, when Education Cannot Wait was established, I mean, very soon we enter into the partnership with the Global Coalition to protect education from attacks. We work very closely, but for those who can't provide the resources, remember, when we started and became operational in 2017, we had an estimated 75 million children, of whom 39 million were girls, that were direct beneficiaries of our support. because of COVID-19 and new conflicts such as Ukraine and continued forced displacement in the Sahel and that region around Central African Republic and Cameroon and so forth, our latest figure is today 222 million children and youth. And if we don't use our funding and our resources and the finances we have to try to bring that number down alongside accountability measures, this might very well double in the near future. So don't let it escalate. Don't let it spiral further. So let me conclude that education cannot wait. We have our financial conference, International Finance Conference in Geneva, hosted by Switzerland, co-convened by Norway, Germany, Niger, Colombia, South Sudan in early 2023 against our strategic plan, which is new, 2023 to 2026, where protection and a human rights, international law-based approach to prevent the damage on schools, teachers, students, school administration, and the whole, I would say, social fabric of a society does not degenerate further through attacks against them. So I'll conclude here, but there are two ways to go. Legal protection through pursuing accountability, physical protection through investing funding so that we can put in place practical protection measures and mitigate the impact on the ground. So we can do something. We can. Let's do it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Sharif, and I really appreciate your ending with a clear call that something can be done. And I appreciate all of our panelists coming forward with the kind of very concrete, practical steps that need to be taken. We've heard about data and specifically collecting information and monitoring on both attacks on schools and a cause of attacks, military use of schools. We've heard about protecting schools before attacks occur, but also responding to attacks and the need to mobilize funding to assist countries in order to do that effectively. And finally, we've heard from our panelists about accountability. And I can't help but remark that these are all commitments that are reflected in the Safe Schools Declaration that provide a real roadmap for how countries can protect schools, teachers, and students during armed conflict. I'd now like to turn back to our panelists to ask them each to respond to a single question. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to give you 2 minutes to reply. So let me pose the question to you. Many endorsing states have taken concrete action to implement the declaration and to better safeguard the right to education for all. What do you believe governments can do to better protect students and educators in armed conflict? And I'll start with Professor Mahir Hazim.
Thank you very much for the question. I would like to echo with other speakers who have talked about accountability earlier. In my opinion, one of the areas that governments could do better is to enhance accountability and create a mechanism through which the perpetrators of attacks on education centers and students could be brought to justice and held accountable for their actions. For instance, the perpetrators of international crimes, including those atrocities, targeted education centers have enjoyed impunity for too long in Afghanistan. Given that the International Criminal Court is trying to resume its investigations in Afghanistan, close coordination and exchange of information and documents need to be established between the ICC and governments on the one hand, and the ICC and human rights organizations on the other. Obviously, accountability through the ICC is one option that may work in countries like Afghanistan or similar situation where the national system is not available now. There is also the option to increase accountability on national level by investigating and prosecuting the perpetrators through national courts or legal system if the relevant governments have the capacity and willingness to do so. I would like to also emphasize on investing and devoting more resources in implementing the declaration. Implementation is the key. Coming from a legal background and researching on international law, it has been always an issue to implement, whether it's declarations or international conventions or treaty. In this case, implementation may also include translating the provisions of the declaration into domestic policies and actionable plans, and monitoring their effective execution. Particularly, conflict-affected countries are usually poor and lack sufficient resources and tools, and thus need financial and capacity building support. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Sharif, let's turn to you for your response.
Well, the response to how governments can better safeguard the right to education, right? I got it right? Yes. I mean, again, we have to, and I come back to what I said earlier. One is to put governments under pressure, I would say awareness of their accountability under international law and the Safe School Declaration. But if you speak about governments who are actually the target of attacks, or non-governmental actors controlling certain territories that are target of attacks against the schools in the territory, all we can do then is, one, as has been said, take it into the national system, as was said by the speaker before me, or when those have been exhausted, to an international court. And I think we need to get serious about international law. If domestic systems have been exhausted, we have to go to international court and the ICC. If we lapse on that, we will continuously live in a world of impunity. And the second one is, as I mentioned, is to invest funding in the countries that are being targeted, so that we who are not involved directly with accountability, but who can do practical measures on the ground, can support the victimized government, schools, teachers who are on the receiving end to take whatever measures required for practical protection. So I come back to what I've said before, I repeat it. 2 concrete actions that we can do is hold the offensive breacher of international law and the Safe School Declaration accountable through the legal system, national and international, provide funding to the governments and the schools and the communities, educational communities on the ground, to take whatever practical measures and build practical measures required to mitigate the impact or prevent attacks. And then, of course, all of this is enveloped by massive, fearless advocacy, speaking truth to power. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Kalamar, over to you.
Thank you. I think I'm not sure there is much for me to add to Mahir and Yasmin. The key issue right now is accountability, and how do we break maybe it's the impunity cycle, but also the fact that of all the war crimes that are being committed in many of the conflicts that have been that are at the heart of the launch today, the attack on school may not come first in the investigation, and I think that's short-sightedness, but it is a reality. So we really need to encourage investigators, the International Criminal Court, and any other international mechanism commission of inquiries and so on to privilege the attacks on education as a strategic entry point into the destruction of civilians' life, civilian infrastructures, and the future of a country. So, it's not neglected by design. It's just that there are too many war crimes being committed, and maybe that one is not top on the list. So we need to put it top on the list. We need to really raise awareness of the ripple effect of an attack on education, the long-term effect. And I think the symbolic value of having real thorough investigations and to break this cycle of impunity around attacks on education. So at least to have 2-3 very profound, important cases where the perpetrators will be brought to account. I think it is going to be fundamentally important to do so. And we haven't done that yet. So we really need, as human rights organization, to encourage the judicial mechanisms to focus on that. We can do that with the prosecutor of Ukraine. They do have a lot of choices, unfortunately, given the number of attacks on education, but the International Criminal Court as well could do so. So that's the first recommendation. The second, I think it goes without saying that the learning, the findings, the recommendations from the Safe School Declaration, as Mahir said, that need to be better domesticated, integrated into the practice, the guidelines. It needs to be made more, an absolute red line benchmark with a lot of practical implications when they are being violated, and judicial implications. So that, to me, needs to be one of the top priority within the military establishment: training of soldiers, enforcement of those policies, and so on and so forth. And then thirdly, I could not put it better than Yasmin. This is a reflection of the general breakdown of an international rule-based system. And the fact that it's not new that schools are targeted, but that education is targeted, but that it is targeted to such an extent, to such a viciousness, to such a scale, I think is really a reflection of how very low our world has gotten to, and fighting back for a better world. Yeah, that ultimately with the kids, standing by the children, and driving that process forward, a better world, a better rule-based system, that, ultimately where we need to go. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I see that Sharif wants to come in.
Yeah, no, I think Agnes inspired me to a third solution, a fourth, and I think they're all intertwined and complementary. But I also think, you see, all these children and adolescents have suffered tremendously. So they know injustice. They know it in their bones and their blood. And I think we need to invest in very focused, concentrated human rights, IHL, Safe School Declaration training, and build their leadership through education to stand up for international law and the Safe Schools Declaration. So I think that, how we shape them, how we shape their minds to take that injustice and the suffering that they have gone through the curriculum, to make sure that we perhaps, we develop, out of the 222 million children, if we could get 10% of them to go out and speak up for human rights, international law, and the Safe Schools Declaration, at least we will have a generation of world citizens who understand what this is all about and don't wonder, what should we do? What should we not do? Is it worth it? Should we really invest money? Should we really go to the court? Who are actually determined to change the tide. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those remarks and for these specific recommendations. I can't help but mention for those of our audience members who want to go more deeply into looking at why there has been so little accountability on the global scale for violations and crimes against children, a very strong report by Save the Children, which is a steering committee member of the Global Coalition called Advancing Justice for Children, that looks at exactly that, why there hasn't been more accountability for violations like attacks on schools, and provides concrete recommendations about what to be done. As we're moving towards the question and answer portion of the afternoon, I want to remind our audience members that you can post questions for our panelists in the chat, and we will come there momentarily. But before that, it is my pleasure to introduce Her Excellency Ms. Maria del Carmen Scef, the Ambassador and Permanent Representative of the Permanent Mission of Argentina to the United Nations. Ambassador. And Ambassador, we'll need you to unmute.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sama, and good morning, colleagues. Really very, very interesting all participations. I am an honor to be participating today in this event, which addresses a topic of the highest importance for Argentina. I would like to start by thanking the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attacks for the elaboration of the report Education Under Attack for the year 2022. I would also like to take this opportunity to acknowledge all the work that Norway, Spain, and Nigeria have been doing together with my own country towards the dissemination and implementation of the Safe Schools Declaration and its guidelines to prevent the military use of schools and universities during armed conflicts, signed at the first conference on the subject held in Oslo, Norway, in 2015. Since the beginning of the processes, Argentina has been an active and strong supporter of this initiative in the understanding that education is fundamental to development and to the full enjoyment of human rights and freedoms, and that continued access to safe education can help protect children and youth from the impacts of armed conflict. Thanks to all our collective hard work. Nowadays, 114 countries have endorsed the declaration. Colleagues, the report presented today is a fundamental tool that allows us to know in greater detail the obstacles and difficulties involved in the custody of education, the state of investigations regarding attacks to educational facilities, and the determination of responsibilities for those attacks, as well as the impact that different decisions have on the future of children and young people. Only by truly understanding what happens and why things happen are we going to be able to move towards a more comprehensive work in order to achieve the protection of education, as most importantly, to save lives. And that is why we are here for. The right to education is a fundamental part of the humanitarian response to emergency situations. It plays a key role in the construction of dialogue within society, which can contribute to building more resilient communities and lead up to the achievement of peace within the framework of unrestricted protection and respect for human rights, international humanitarian law, and international law. The current international reality and the data reflected in the report that the Global Coalition elaborated challenges us to continue working for the universalization of the Safe School Declaration, not only to prevent the military use of educational facilities, but also to protect education and guarantee the continuity of the enjoyment of this human right for all people during armed conflicts and other situations of violence. Until finish, one word more. This year, we will participate in a summit for transformation of education. I believe it is in 19th of September, during the in parallel or high-level week, where will be the president of our country. I believe in this very important summit, one word, one idea of this problem will be there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And now it's my pleasure to introduce His Excellency Ambassador Samson Iteboje, the Director of International Organizations Department, Ministry of Foreign Affairs for the Federal Republic of Nigeria. Ambassador.
Thank you, Ms. Zamaneff, for the effective manner you have moderated this event. I would also like to thank the panelists for their very insightful interventions. Let me quickly note that I'm delivering this statement on behalf of the Honorable Minister of Foreign Affairs, who would have been here, but for some unforeseen circumstances. It gives me great pleasure to be here to deliver the closing remarks on his behalf on this day that we are launching Education Under Attack Report 2022. This event also marks the 7th anniversary of the Safe Schools Declaration, a process which has been endorsed by over 114 states. As we have heard from the panelists, the threat of or actual use of force against students, teachers, academics, other education personnel or educational facilities and materials, as well as the military use of school, is very worrisome. For us in Nigeria, following the endorsement of the declaration, we have taken steps to ensure that education is protected from attack during conflict. It will be recalled that in October 2021, Nigeria, with the support of Argentina, Norway, Spain, AU Commission, and the GCPEA, hosted the 4th International Conference on Safe Schools Declaration, during which Nigeria demonstrated its entrenched commitment to ensuring that schools are safe, protected, and preserved from harm and attack during conflict. Nigeria has continued to make obvious and shared good practices in the implementation of the declaration and guaranteeing the right to education for all. In particular, in places affected by conflict, Nigeria has strengthened commitment under a Safe Schools Declaration Plan of Action for the period 2021 to 2023 by ensuring that we make schools and learning centers safe, secure, and accessible to all. The government of Nigeria, through the Federal Ministry of Education, has developed certain key objectives, implementation approach and strategies, as well as monitoring and evaluation template in order to achieve the goals of the plan of action. Importantly, His Excellency President Muhammadu Buhari's declaration that Nigeria's annual domestic education expenditure will progressively increase by 50% over the next 2 years and up to 100% by 2025 during the July 2021 Global Education Summit on Financing Global Partnership for Education, gives enormous impetus to achieving this important national education development objective. Nigeria remains committed to the objectives of the Safe Schools Declaration. In this direction, we will continue to foster collaborations with partners and relevant stakeholders in ensuring the domestication of the SSD and other related international protocols and guidelines for promoting safety, security in schools and learning centers. Similarly, we will sustain efforts at and facilitate effective implementation of the national policy on safety, security, and violence-free schools and learning centers, while ensuring stakeholders' accountability for safe, secure, and enabling environment in schools and learning centers. Ladies and gentlemen, as we all know, the minimum standards for safe schools outline the comprehensive tools, qualities, and practices that schools should have and adhere to in order to keep learners, teachers, and school environment safe, secure, and violence-free. In this regard, I would like to call on our partners to increase support level and sustain ongoing collaborative efforts towards meeting and overcoming challenges arising due to crisis, conflict, which hamper or inhibit the possibility of guaranteeing safe schools environment. Finally, I would like to thank the shared efforts of the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack, GCPEA, the governments of Argentina, Norway, and Spain in fostering alliances towards preventing education from attack through the implementation of the SSD. It is our hope that with the launch of this report, states that are yet to key into this important process will be motivated to do so by endorsing the Safe Schools Declaration. Thank you and best wishes.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And especially thank you for mentioning Nigeria's hosting of the 4th International Conference on Safe Schools last fall. I think it's worth mentioning that this was the 4th conference following convenings of states in Oslo starting in 2015, then Buenos Aires, then Palma de Mallorca. I think these kinds of convenings for states to really talk about what it means to implement the Safe Schools Declaration illustrates the importance of a sustained commitment to protecting education from attack, that kind of sustained commitment that actually produces change. Now I'd like to turn to the question and answer period of our session, and we'll open the floor for questions from the audience. I believe we only have time for 3 questions, but we've had some excellent ones submitted already. And I'm going to start, Marika and Jerome, I'd like to turn to you first. You mentioned that military use of schools and universities has actually increased in the last 2 years, which I think is particularly interesting to us in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. Can you tell us more about why this rise in cases has occurred? And I'm wondering if there's more you'd like particularly to say about the guidelines for protecting schools and universities from military use, which are endorsed by the Safe Schools Declaration.
Thank you so much, Seema. This is a really complex and interesting question. And I have to say that when we started to add up all of the global numbers for 2020 and 2021, we were really taken aback when we saw that huge spike in military use. To see that number double was really, really alarming. And I do want to drive home the fact that a lot of, behind this drive is the spike in Myanmar, which accounted for nearly 40% of all cases of military use. In 2020, we saw 30 verified cases of military use in Myanmar compared to nearly 200 in 2021. And most of those occurred after the coup, the February 1st coup in 2021. I do have to say that given the fact that schools were still closed due to COVID-19 and were actually set to reopen shortly after that coup, we can't draw a direct correlation, but we do wonder if schools being closed might have contributed to some of that military use. We have done other analyses, though, that tell a different and perhaps a little bit more positive story. In spite of this global rise in military use, we have been tracking incidents and cases of military use in countries that endorsed the Safe Schools Declaration in its first 2 years. So we did see that in countries that endorsed in 2015 and 2016, there are about 13 countries. We actually did see sustained declines in those countries in military use. And in some of those countries, we have also seen targeted actions, including policy change, military doctrine change that could have supported that. And so we do want to highlight that although on the whole attacks are going up, if we zoom into these countries where targeted actions are being taken to prevent and refrain from military use of schools and universities, that work is being done to stop this violation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to turn to Professor Hazim to talk about attacks on higher education, which when the coalition first started working on this issue was one of the most underreported areas when it came to attacks on schools and universities. Education Under Attack 2022 reports over 320 incidents of attacks on higher education in the countries profiled from 2020 to 2021. Professor, could you tell us more about what can be done to better protect higher education during armed conflict?
Thank you for the question. I think, just going back to our previous conversation, ensuring the enforcement of international humanitarian law norms in the conflict area is crucial to protect higher education during armed conflict. I think it's very important to work with parties to conflict and make it clear to them that education centers or universities are protected places under international humanitarian law. I recently, for example, saw news that an NGO was working with the Taliban militia and teaching them about international humanitarian law. I think those kind of activities and to educate and teach parties to the conflicts and their whether they're soldiers or militias to understand humanitarian law and avoid attacking universities or other educational centers is very important. Also, I think pressuring the parties is important, and it requires a concrete and coordinated response from the international community and the United Nations to put more pressure and understand what leverage they have to pressure the parties of the conflict and make their behavior in accordance with the international humanitarian law norms, and ultimately and hopefully this help protect universities and education centers more.
Thank you very much. Now I have two more burning questions, so I'll ask them very briefly to our other panelists. The first is a question for Ms. Kalamard about explosive weapons, which were involved in 1/5 of all reported attacks on education, according to the report. Ms. Kalamard, could you tell us more about what could be done to address attacks on education, specifically using explosive weapons?
Well, the problem is that, well, it's not a problem, but the use of explosive weapons. And by this, we mean, in general, weapons that are either banned under international law or weapons who are likely to have a real disproportionate impact. Even if they are not banned, they should be banned. So we are seeing a multiplication of the use of those weapons in certainly in Ukraine, in many other conflicts. The international legal framework is very clear that you should not use those kind of weapons, certainly not in urban settings, certainly not in settings where they are likely to have disproportionate effect on civilian infrastructures, including therefore on education. So that's the law is there, the international law is there. There is another initiative right now around the use of certain kind of weapon in urban setting, which could go some way towards strengthening the normative framework where weapons are not banned per se, but where their use should really be discouraged to the extent possible. So I'm hoping that this initiative will materialize very soon with a very strong declaration, which will be then adopted by a number of governments. I think the key, I think, is to really keep documenting. We need to keep documenting how much those weapons are being used and the effect they are, the disproportionate impact they are having, and the devastating impact they are having, and hoping that the more we do that, the greater will be the commitment to stop using them.
Thank you very much. And I'm told we need to move on to the statements portion, so I'm going to have to save my last burning question, I suppose, for a private conversation. Now is the period of time where we have the opportunity to open the floor for interventions. I'll ask those who would like to make an intervention to keep your intervention to 1 minute so we can hear from as many states as possible. If we do run out of time, you can send your written statements to us by email, and the coalition will upload those on our website. I'd like to first start with Deputy Permanent Representative Ms. Sasha Jurejo from the Permanent Mission of Slovenia. Over to you.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank the organizers of this timely event, and thank you also to the briefers and the panelists for all your sobering reports and for all your recommendations, and also for your meaningful work, of course. Slovenia is among the countries that endorse the Safe Schools Declaration, and we advocate for the implementation of these recommendations and to commitments to protect education in conflict. Attacks against schools constitute a grave violation against children in armed conflict and the international law. The increasing rate of deliberate targeting of schools in armed conflicts around the world is alarming. Children without access to education face increased risk of poverty, exclusion, marginalization, and violence. And in armed conflicts, education is one of the few signs of hope and safety for children. Access to safe and quality education during armed conflicts is crucial for children's reintegration. It also enables them to contribute to the post-conflict reconstruction and reconciliation. Therefore, we need to ensure that schools are and that they remain a place full of curiosity, laughter, and hope for a better future for children. I thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I'd like to give the floor to Deputy Permanent Representative Adrian Haury from Switzerland. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Sama, and dear colleagues. Good morning. I'd like to thank the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack, as well as all the permanent missions and the PRs of Argentina, Nigeria, Norway, and Spain for organizing this briefing today, also for the very good discussion, the burning questions, which are, of course, highly relevant. They cover also matters of international humanitarian law, and thanks for this. Switzerland would like to thank the GCPA for their report and welcomes the important insights into education in emergencies, as well as your call for action. So today's event marks the 7th anniversary of the Safe Schools Declaration, and Switzerland, as others, is one of the 114 signatories of the declaration. And we call on all member states to endorse, implement, and support this declaration. To make the right to education a reality for all children, Switzerland pledged at the Global Refugee Forum in 2019 to make Geneva a global hub for education in emergencies. So this hub was launched last year and engages a multitude of actors to come together and to deliver safe and quality education to crisis-affected children and youth. Education in emergencies is a priority and remains a priority for Switzerland. We support education on policy as well as operational levels in conflict and crisis affected countries. The importance of education in emergencies is clear, and yet education appeals receive less than 2% of humanitarian funding. So more political commitment and financial resources are needed to address the funding gap in education in emergencies. More is definitely needed. And this is why Switzerland is partnering with Education Cannot Wait. We'll listen carefully and hear the call for funding, which we support very much. We will co-host a high-level financing conference in Geneva in February 2023 with Germany and Norway as co-conveners to raise additional funds for quality education in emergencies and protracted crises. So for a child, continuing his or her education in times of crisis is synonymous with survival, with protection and with hope. And we will continue to work with partners to make this a reality for all children everywhere. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Now I would like to give the floor to the Deputy Permanent Representative from Malta, Ms. Francesca Gatt.
Thank you very much, colleagues and friends, and thank you, of course, to the organizers and the Global Coalition for this interesting yet sobering report. 6 attacks a day is unacceptable. Any attack, even one attack a day, is absolutely unacceptable. And the report that you have presented today on the 7th anniversary of the Safe Schools Declaration shows how much work we still need to do, even though we are at 114 countries who have endorsed it. And I think key to the report are the recommendations, because here is where us as member states can take this report forward and work on what has been reported. So data is important when it comes to policy and when it comes to what we can do on a national level and an international level, but recommendations are also key because we want to we want to address the situation. And as others have said, of course, the military use of and attacks against schools must end, and students and teachers must be protected. And we all have a shared responsibility. And of course, because education and literacy skills fosters in children, not only, as Amnesty International said, it is a place of protection, but also that education can be a catalyst for lasting peace and security. Malta strongly believes that the Safe Schools Declaration has a crucial role to play in protecting education from attack, and we will continue to encourage others to endorse and implement the declaration in order to safeguard the right to education for all. And going forward, when we come to education, literacy, and also children armed conflict, for us, these are clear priorities when we should be elected to the Security Council. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, please let me give the floor to Sri Lankan Ambassador Mohan Pieris.
Thank you, Sama, for guiding this discussion along so effectively. Sri Lanka welcomes the launch of the Education Under Attack 2022 report. Now, one of the most basic obligations of IHL is the protection of children, civilians, the protection of their rights, one of them being to their right to education and access to facilities. Now, the deprivation of access to education in conflict zones is akin to taking away a child's future. As we all are aware, without education, the cyclical trap of children in conflict will continue, enhancing the risk of children being inducted into conflict-related activity as no viable alternative would be available for their own survival. Sri Lanka overcame a decade of civil conflict. Allow me, Chair, to part with some key takeaways that are relevant in this regard. Education, as I think, cannot be protected if places of education are not safe from conflict. Education cannot be protected if those imparting knowledge suffer physical harm. Now, this requires parties to a conflict exercising military restraint around school zones. It requires parties to a conflict in clear terms marking schools as safe zones and adhering to terms of not using educational facilities as bases, barracks, detention centers, weapon storage units. Now, this problem can be circumvented in a large measure with the availability of digital technology, which allows our students to connect with their teachers and the learning material from the safety of their homes. Educational technology could be a new focus on investment for governments or multilateral organizations working in areas of conflict to pursue. I can say it with a sense of satisfaction that throughout the conflict in Sri Lanka, we took great care to ensure the safety of educational institutions throughout its entire period, as we as a nation give education priority, the highest priority of place when it comes to human activity. Madam Chair, may I also say this? It's easy to identify governments who occupy schools or institutions which we know. But the problem really is when it comes to non-state actors, how do we deal with them? Now, perhaps it may be worth a study to find out who arms them, who finances them, who gets them going to destroy our schools. Why are they destroying our schools, which is perhaps the cradle of civilization for many countries? So I think it's time that we actually undertake a very close study of those aspects. I thank you again for convening this meeting, and I look forward to the 222 report and the rich exchange of ideas on this very topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And let me now give the floor to Ireland, to Mr. Donald Keneally.
Thanks very much, and thank you to all of those involved in both the production of the Education Under Attack 2022 report and in today's rich and insightful discussion. Events such as this one are vital to raise the awareness of the extent of violence against students and educators in conflict settings. The report will be a vital resource for us as we work to protect education from attack. Ireland is very proud of our work in promoting the protection of education in conflict settings, including in the UN Security Council. Through the Children and Armed Conflict Working Group, we have strengthened language on humanitarian access, the best interests of the child, and an SRHR in working group conclusions in areas such as Myanmar, Syria, and South Sudan. While progress has been made in implementing the Safe Schools Declaration, attacks in education and military use of schools have increased in many areas around the world. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has led to hundreds of schools being damaged by heavy artillery, airstrikes, and explosive weapons, and seen many more used for military purposes. But we must not forget that it's not just in Ukraine that this is happening. For example, the GCPEA report measuring the impact of attacks on education in Palestine notes that the number of explosive weapons attacks in schools in Palestine increased from 5 in 2020 to over 272 in 2021. It's clear that we have much to do, and events such as this are important in building support for the declaration. And like others who've spoken today, we call for the universalization of the declaration as soon as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And next, I'd like to turn to the Deputy Permanent Representative of Poland, Ms. Joanna Skoczek.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I would like to say a big thank you to the organizers and to all the briefers, and especially to Madame Agnieszka Lamar from Amnesty International for her very insightful and very concrete remarks, and also for underlying the question of accountability. Because if we cannot prevent the attacks, we for sure as international community can do our utmost to help those that are attacking the schools accountable for that, and not just for that. Attacks on schools are in fact attacks on international agreed commitments, on international humanitarian law, on human rights, but also on sustainable development goals. Every time a school is attacked, the SDG goal number 4, quality education, is farther from being achieved in a reasonable time, not to mention other commitments. And the attacks in education, the attacks on school is attack on education, which is one of the most important components of social development worldwide. And as United Nations foresees and plans now for a series of summits, we think we need to include the problem of the security of schools and attacks on schools into the agenda of those summits. And just to remind you, we will start with Transformational Education Summit in September on the margin of United Nations General Assembly High-Level Week. But this summit will be followed by a summit for the future next year. So it should be in our common interest to include this element into the discussion, because only on such a high-level fora we can elaborate solutions that may help us to stop these attacks, and if not stop them, then eliminate as much as possible, but also help those who are committing those atrocities accountable. And attacks on schools have many dimensions, just to name the physical dimensions of destruction of a safe place for children to learn and play, but also on a social level, banning children, and especially girls, from attending schools. So it has much far-reaching implications than just the physical attacks. And these attacks have long-lasting effects, not just on physical infrastructure, as I said, and safety of people present during the attacks, but also on psychological conditions of children and teachers, resulting in trauma. And we do see this from a very close perspective, welcoming hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian children fleeing the war right now to Poland, and also guaranteeing them continuous access to education. But it should never happen in the very first place. So thank you once again, and thank you to all the organizations and NGOs that are active in this field. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. And thank you in particular for mentioning opportunities like the Transforming Education Summit that's coming up in September. There's also right before that, September 9th, the International Day to Protect Education from Attack. These are not just rhetorical moments, but they are moments for states to step forward, and if they've not already done so, to endorse the Safe Schools Declaration, and for those that have, to share how they are implementing the commitments in that declaration. It is my real pleasure to thank our panel members and also the audience for a deep and meaningful discussion today on these devastating findings on Education Under Attack 2020. I think the research from the Global Coalition makes it very clear that education isn't just a casualty of conflict, but schools, teachers, students, and universities are being intentionally targeted as a tactic of war, both in countries that are well covered in headlines, but also those countries that are overlooked. And worse, in the last 2 years, we have seen attacks on schools and military use actually increase, a statistic that should be alarming to all of us. This is devastating to individuals, to the 9,000 students and teachers who were injured or even killed, but it also has deep and often lasting impacts on communities and the futures of the countries they are in. Attacks on schools are not like the weather. They are intentional decisions, and they don't have to happen. And we have heard from our panelists how states can prevent attacks, including, for example, by restricting military use of schools, but also by deterring future attacks, including by ensuring accountability, both at the national level, but also we've heard about the need to do much more to ensure that international mechanisms address violations and crimes against children in their mandates and in their evidence collection from the very outset, so that we can have more accountability for something that is such a pervasive part of armed conflict. I'll bring our program to conclusion by encouraging all of you to take a look at the report itself. It is online. I believe we're going to show on the screen the web address where it can be reached, but you can also find it and more information about the Global Coalition on GCPIA's website, which is protectingeducation.org. Thank you all very much for attending today, for your commitments to protecting education during armed conflict, and we hope that you will take a close look at the report. Thank you.